News of the times. He slept beside his brother, then butchered him with an axe. The 1857 Maidstone Fratricide. Welcome to News of the Times. In March of 1857, the town of Maidstone was rocked by a crime so brutal, so cold-blooded, that even the seasoned local coroner struggled to speak of it without pause. Two brothers shared a modest room in a working-class home on Bedford Row. One, a respected gardener known for his quiet industry. The other, an idle and resentful youth who had long refused honest work. As their parents and younger brother slept just one wall away, the eldest, Thomas Edwards, was bludgeoned in his bed with such savage force that his skull split open, the axe striking again and again until his lower jaw was nearly severed. No warning, no struggle, just the wet, heavy thud of violence in the night, and then a mother's scream piercing through the silence as she found her son blood-soaked and beyond help. But where was the younger brother, George? Gone. Escaped into the woods, hunted across the countryside until finally cornered on a quiet Rochester street. Now, was this premeditated fratricide, malice years in the making, or a sudden deranged explosion from a troubled mind? This is the case of George Keble Edwards and the night Maidstone woke to horror. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, one man insured 1,000 cigars against fire and then smoked every single one and tried to claim the lot. The insurance company was not amused. The result? A blazing row over burnt goods and one very singed fraudster. So, grab your cup of tea, make sure that your axe is exactly where you left it, and settle in. It's time for another tale of Victorian horrors, brotherly betrayal, and just a little bit of cigar-based insurance fraud to round things off. So, sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the show. Background. The Edwards family of 21 Bedford Row in Maidstone belonged to the artisan class, honest, working folk, weathering life's hardships in modest circumstances. The patriarch, David Edwards, was once the heir to a small farm inherited from his own father, a Welsh paymaster sergeant, who settled in Cox Heath in the 1790s. But after financial losses, David became a labourer in Maidstone, raising his family on slender means. David and his wife Mary Ann Edwards had at least 5 sons. The eldest, Thomas Edwards, was 24 at the time of his death. He was a steady, hard-working young man employed as a gardener's labourer and well respected in the community. In stark contrast, their 4th son, George Keble Edwards, was just 18 and had long been a source of concern. Idle, taciturn, and increasingly odd in his behaviour, George hadn't held steady work in over a year and was known to associate with rough company around town. The youngest son, Samuel, was only 9 years old and still lived at home with his parents. Another son, William, was married and lived just 2 doors away, and it was William who came running to help when the alarm was raised on the night of the murder. The household itself was a cramped 4-room terrace cottage with Thomas and George sharing a small back bedroom and the parents and young Samuel sleeping in the front. Life was quiet, if tense. Thomas often reproached George for his idleness. Although no recent quarrels were noted, that changed abruptly after Thomas reportedly threatened to have George turned out if he refused to work. The family fortunes, such as they were, ended in horror when George, under the influence of alcohol and wounded pride, fatally attacked his sleeping brother with an axe in the dead of night. From the Maidstone Journal and Kentish Advertiser on the 24th of March, 1857, horrible murder in Maidstone. It is our painful duty to chronicle this week one of the most cold-blooded and atrocious murders ever perpetrated. In Bedford Row, Wheeler Street in Maidstone, reside a respectable family of the class of artisans named Edwards. Mr. and Mrs. Edwards had two sons at home, one 24 years of age and the other 18. The eldest, an industrious young man, was employed as a gardener's labourer at Mr. Stone's in Heath Road. The younger son was an idle, good-for-nothing fellow who had been living on his father and mother for some time. On Wednesday night, Thomas Edwards, the victim of this atrocious fratricide, went home at about 7 o'clock, ate his supper, and then went to bed, and was quickly in a state of that sound repose which health and labour bestows. Mrs. Edwards chopped some wood for the morning's fire, and at about 10 o'clock went to bed also, leaving the younger son in the house. And in a few moments she heard him come upstairs and go into the bedroom of Thomas, with whom he usually slept. She then went down again to see if the doors were fastened, as George was in the habit of going out after the family were in bed and leaving the door unfastened. She then went to bed, but shortly afterwards was disturbed by a dreadful moaning, as if of a person in pain. She ran to the room where her sons slept and found the candle burning on a box by the bedside, and Thomas in bed, weltering in his own blood, there being one deep cut which seemed to sever the chin from the face, and 4 other severe wounds of the same character. She at once gave an alarm, and Mr. Saunders, surgeon, was immediately sent for, and was quickly in attendance, but the unfortunate man was beyond the help of all human skill. He lingered until 7:45 the next morning, and then expired, having been unable to give any indication of the mode in which the fearful crime had been perpetrated. A large carpenter's axe, covered with blood and hair, which lay upon the floor, was undoubtedly the weapon, and the perpetrator can have been no other than the dead man's brother. Mr. Superintendent Blundell was on the spot almost immediately after the alarm was given, and picked men were put upon the traces of the murderer. He managed to escape detection by hiding in the Boxley woods, but he was taken at about 6 o'clock on Friday morning in the High Street of Rochester by Police Constable Thomas Smith, number 11 of the City Force, and transferred at once to the safe keeping of Inspector Tuff. On being asked if his name was Edwards, he replied in the affirmative, and admitted also that he came from Maidstone. On being told on what charge he was apprehended, he remained silent. He was taken before the city magistrate and formally remitted to Maidstone, where he arrived by the train at 12:45, and was at once taken to the town hall and placed before the mayor and a full bench. On being asked his name, he replied in a bold and confident tone, "George Keble Edwards." He is low in stature, looks older than he is, and has a peculiar fullness in the lower part of the face. The chin is small, and expressions resolute, and his glance quick and excited. Mr. Blundell, having stated the nature of the charge, asked for a remand until next Friday. The prisoner stated, "Well, all I have to say is that I am innocent of the crime accused of me. I was in Boxley last night at 7:15. The inquest into Thomas Edwards' death was held just 2 days after the murder, at the Royal George Inn in Maidstone. What followed was grim, not just in detail, but in circumstance. The grieving parents, David and Mary Ann Edwards, were called to testify, not as victims, but as witnesses. They were made to stand in public before a full jury and give calm, factual evidence about the death of their eldest son, while naming their younger son as the only person who could have committed the crime. It is a bleak portrait. The mother was asked to confirm the still bloodied axe was her own. The father pressed on whether his sons quarrelled. The child, Samuel, asleep in the next room. All of it detailed in the cold, formal tones of the 1857 press. But what they were being asked to do was unthinkable. The inquest. The inquest was held on Friday at the Royal George. The jury having proceeded to view the body, the following evidence was called. Mary Ann Edwards. I am the wife of David Edwards, a labourer living at number 21 Bedford Row. I am the mother of the deceased, whose name was Thomas Edwards. He was a labourer and resided with us. My husband, myself, the deceased, and our two sons, George and Samuel, lived in the house. On Wednesday evening, Thomas, the deceased, went to bed at about 8:30. George was out, and he came home at about 10 o'clock. My husband and Samuel went to bed about the same time as Thomas. I sat up till George came home, and after having had some supper, I went to bed at about 10:30, leaving him downstairs. I went down into the cellar at about 10:15 and chopped some wood with the axe, which I left lying in the cellar, and a few minutes after I went to bed. I heard George come upstairs and go into the room where he slept with his brother Thomas. No one else slept in that room but him and his brother. I went downstairs after that to see that the doors were all locked, because I was afraid that George would leave them unfastened, as he sometimes did so, and went out in the night. Both doors were fastened, and there was no one downstairs. I and my husband and my youngest son Samuel slept in the front room together. I went to sleep almost directly, and was awoken at about 12:30 by hearing a moaning. I directly got a light and went into the other room, where I found Thomas lying on the bed, insensible, bleeding very much. There was a candle alight in the room, and the windows was wide open. George was not there. I saw him bleeding, but I did not look at him any more. My husband then called Mr. King and Mr. Lee, who live in adjoining houses, and also my son William, who lived 2 doors from our house. A flower pot was standing on the windowsill of the back bedroom on Wednesday evening, but when I went into the room on hearing the moaning, I saw that it had fallen down and was broken on the pavement below. On going downstairs, I noticed that a pane of glass in the back room downstairs was also broken. Mr. Saunders came at about 20 minutes after the alarm was raised. George was in the habit of sleeping on the side of the bed next to the window. I did not hear him speak or any noise after all that I went upstairs. Just 2 days before the murder, there had been a conversation over breakfast. The father had found work for George, a chance perhaps to set his son on a better path. But George didn't want to go. His older brother Thomas had pressed the point. If George wouldn't work, then he should be turned out of the house. It wasn't a fight, no shouting, just a tense moment at the table. One brother trying to uphold the family's respectability, the other stewing in silence. No one knew then, but that simple exchange may have been the spark, the catalyst for the horror that followed. On Monday, My husband told George at breakfast time that he had got some work for him. George did not appear to like to go when Thomas said that if he didn't go, he should turn him out of doors. My husband said, "Oh, never mind, never mind." George was very strange in his manner and sometimes walked about downstairs, but I do not know what for. George was very taciturn, but the two appeared to live on good terms, and they were not in the habit of quarrelling with each other. They did not quarrel on the Wednesday. I never heard George threaten his brother. The axe with which the deed had been committed, a carpenter's axe, was then shown to her, and she stated that it was the one that she had left in the cellar on Wednesday night. Upon one side, the axe was covered with blood, and the witness was much affected at the sight of the terrible weapon. David Edwards, father to the brothers, had always tried to keep the peace between his sons. He'd heard the sharp words. Thomas, the eldest, frustrated by George's refusal to work. George, in turn, sullen and irritable whenever the subject was raised. But they didn't quarrel openly, not in front of their father. So David let it be. Never mind, he'd said, let it go. On the night of the murder, he was in bed by 8. His youngest son, Samuel, slept beside him. At some point in the night, he was awoken by a crash, then a moaning sound, something unnatural, something wrong. His wife lit a candle. They crossed the hall together, and what they found in that black bedroom would tear their family apart. Mr. G. Saunders, surgeon on Brewer Street, said, "I was called in to attend the deceased on Thursday morning, and reaching the house at 20 minutes to 1 o'clock, I found him quite insensible and unable to speak. The pillow where his head had been lying was saturated with blood. On examining him, I found 2 very severe wounds upon his head. One was at the upper part of the left side of the head, between the parietal and frontal bones. It was about 5 inches in length and extending to the lower lobe of the ear. The skull and the temple bone were divided, and at some part the wound penetrated the membrane of the brain. I believe that that was the first wound he received, and that he was asleep at the time. There was a second wound at the back of the head, about 3 inches long, and that also cut through the skull. A portion of the lower jaw was severed from the upper part. There was a very slight wound just at the tip of the chin. There was a wound in the throat about 2.5 inches from the chin. Some part of it was very superficial, but about half an inch of it penetrated to the windpipe. The first wound was of itself sufficient to cause death, as was also the second. There were no other marks of violence on the body. I've examined the brain and found a considerable extravasation of blood on the left side of the head, corresponding to the first wound." After hearing the evidence, the coroner instructed the jury to consider whether the killing had been premeditated and whether there was any reason to doubt George Edwards' sanity. The jury took little time. Their conclusion: wilful murder by George Keble Edwards. With that, the case was formally passed on to the courts for trial. From the Maidstone Journal and Kentish Advertiser, the 28th of March, 1857, the examination of the murderer Edwards. George Keble Edwards was brought again before the magistrates. He looked cleaner, calmer, and just as indifferent as before. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied, "All I have to say is that I am quite innocent of the crime, and I don't see why you are to keep me like this." Remanded once more, he was led out to await transfer to the county jail. As he stood outside, an officer informed him of the coroner's verdict. Wilful murder, he was told. George gave half a laugh. just what I expected from them, he said. But when the trial comes on and I've got someone to speak for me, my father and mother, it'll be very different. You'll see. From the Maidstone Journal and Kentish Advertiser, the 4th of April, 1857, the late murder committal of the accused. George Kebble Edwards was again placed at the bar. He exhibited the same carelessness, indifference which he had hitherto done, and appeared the least moved of any person in the court at the recital of some of the most distressing portions of the evidence. Whenever he spoke, it was in a clear, loud tone of voice. Mr. Case, clerk to the magistrate, to the prisoner. Is your name George Kebble Edwards, prisoner? It is, sir. Mr. Case. You are charged with the wilful murder. The prisoner made no answer. Still indifferent, he gave no defence, only muttering that he didn't see why he was being held. But a clearer picture of his movements was beginning to emerge. On the morning after the attack, George had turned up at the home of his uncle, a man he hadn't seen in years, claiming to have walked all night after escorting a young woman home to Boxley. He spent the day there, slept deeply, and left that evening. The next morning, he was spotted in the street of Rochester. When approached by police, George seemed unconcerned. Even when asked to undress for a search, he shrugged. You won't find no spots of blood on me, he said. He was right. They didn't. But the words lingered, the tone, the timing. As the officer later recalled, when I'd finished searching him, he just said, There, I told you you wouldn't. 4 months after the murder, the case of Regina versus George Kebble Edwards was brought before the Maidstone Assizes. He now stood in the dock at just 18 years old, charged with the wilful murder of his brother, Thomas. From the start, George maintained his innocence, but the evidence had mounted steadily, and the courtroom was soon filled with the quiet horror of what had taken place that night on Bedford Row. For the prosecution, Sir Walter Riddle opened the case. From the Maidstone Journal and Kentish Advertiser, the 4th of August, 1857, the Maidstone Fratricide. George Kebble Edwards, at age 18, was charged with the wilful murder of his brother, Thomas Edwards, on the 19th day of March at Maidstone. Sir Walter Riddle, Bart, and Mr. Russell appeared for the prosecution, and Mr. Denman for the prisoner. Mr. Walter Riddle, in opening the case, said, It is my painful duty on the part of the Crown to state to this jury before you the circumstances under which the prisoner at the bar is charged with the wilful murder of his own brother. The deceased was the eldest son of a labouring man named Daniel Edwards, living with his wife and family at 21 Bedford Row in this town, not far from this place, at the back of the jail on the Boxley Road. The family consisted of the deceased, Thomas, who was about 24 years of age, the prisoner George, who was between 18 and 19, and a little boy named Samuel, who is about 9 years old. They all lived together, and the father and the mother and Samuel slept in one room, while the deceased and the prisoner slept in the other room. It will appear that Thomas was a steady, well-conducted young man, maintaining himself by hard work and industry, and it will probably appear that that was not the case with the prisoner at the bar. He, on the contrary, was an idle lad, and you will find at all events that he was not regularly at home. On the Monday, 2 days before the 19th of March, when the murder was committed, the family were all at home, and the father informed the prisoner that he had got some work for him with his own employer. The prisoner said he had got work elsewhere, and a quarrel then took place between him and his brother. They were angry, but went upstairs to bed together as usual. The next day passed, and the following day, the 19th, without any renewal of the quarrel. On the evening of that day, the father and the mother, the deceased and the little boy, were all at home early. At about 8, the father and the little boy went up to bed, and the mother remained below with the deceased. In about half an hour afterwards, the deceased went to bed, leaving his mother alone, waiting, in fact, for the prisoner. As soon as the deceased had gone upstairs, which was at about 8:30, the mother busied herself with preparations for the following day, and amongst other duties went into the cellar to chop some fuel. This was done with an axe, which, and this is an important fact, she left behind in the cellar. At about 9:30, the prisoner returned home. He had no conversation with his mother, who at about 10:15 went upstairs and left the prisoner alone below in the back room, out of which went the stairs down to the cellar and up into the bedrooms. The mother, in going upstairs, looked into her son's bedroom and found Thomas fast asleep in his bed. In about 10 minutes, she heard the prisoner go up into his room, the same as that in which his brother slept. She then, and this is most important, went downstairs to see if the doors were fast, because the prisoner was in the habit of going out late at night and found them all fast. She then went to bed and was soon fast asleep. This was about 10:30 at night, and all the members of the family were then gone to their bedrooms and supposed to be asleep. The mother was awakened by hearing, as she thought, a sort of moaning. She awoke her husband and got a light and went into her son's room. There she found the deceased, Thomas Edwards, with his bed undisturbed and no one stirring in his bed. Just about that time, the little girl had been alarmed by what she calls a sort of blundering. She then heard the window open and somebody run past underneath. By this time, Edward's father was rapping at number 20 for assistance. She got up and went with Edward to Edwards's cottage. She then saw it was 20 minutes to 1 o'clock. They found under the window a broken flower pot, which had been previously outside the window of the room occupied by the prisoner, and a pane broken in the window below, evidently by some person getting out of the upper windows. Alarm was given and a policeman came, who found the axe under the bed, partially concealed by some clothes. It was the same axe as that which had been left in the cellar and was now covered with blood and human hair. The deceased lay with his head hewn to pieces, there being 2 terrific cuts, each of which divided both scalp and skull. He never spoke again and died at about 8 o'clock. Such were the circumstances attending his death. And where was the prisoner all this time? At 10:15, he went up to the bedroom and remained quiet till his mother had gone to bed. And where was he? If he had not the person who committed the murder, the subsequent account of his movements is very material. You will find him at 9 o'clock on the morning after the murder at the house of his uncle at Brompton, near Chatham, 9 miles off. His uncle had not seen him for some years, and after he had explained who he was, he said he'd been up all night, having taken a young woman home to Boxley. He remained there and went to bed. At 5 o'clock he got up and went away, saying if he didn't go home he should come back again. He did not come back and was apprehended in the streets of Rochester next morning. These are all the facts of the case. You will have no doubt that this dreadful murder was committed in the dead of the night in question. The deceased was seen by his mother lying quietly asleep at 10:15. No one else is known to have entered that room. The prisoner was the last person seen going up. It is for him to explain how and when he left that room. And in the absence of any such explanation, it is for you to say whether or not he committed this murder. For the defence, Mr. Denman faced what he called the most painful duty of an advocate, to plead for a life when the odds were already set. He asked the jury to remember that George Edwards had always been odd, silent, eccentric, withdrawn, and though the prisoner himself refused to plead insanity, his defence remained the same simple innocence. The case, Denman reminded them, was built only on circumstance. The doors might have been fastened, but the windows were not. Was it impossible, he asked, that an intruder had entered, and that George, restless and sleepless as ever, had gone out again, unaware of the horror within? He pointed to the absence of blood on George's clothing, to his gentle nature, his fondness for animals, and his strange, harmless habits, shaving twice a day when he had no beard, hiding for hours in empty rooms. Denman ended with an appeal for mercy, that this tragedy should not rob the parents of both their sons, one in the grave and one at the gallows. In summing up, the judge dismissed both lines of the defence. The claim of insanity, he said, had not been proved, and could not stand on so small an amount of evidence. The father himself had seen nothing to suggest his son was of unsound mind. As for the idea of a midnight intruder, his lordship reminded the jury that there had been no robbery, and that the family's humble home offered nothing worth stealing. If you believe, he said, that the facts admit of any rational doubt, that you must acquit. But if they do not, if they lead to one clear conclusion, then it is your solemn duty to pronounce the prisoner guilty. The jury retired to consider their verdict at 25 minutes past 2 o'clock. The jury, in about 10 minutes, returned to court and delivered a verdict of guilty. His lordship assumed the black cap, immediately passing sentence as follows: George Keble Edwards, you have been convicted of the wilful murder of your own brother. The facts proved against you were too strong with all the chances. I should say fair play the law gives to prisoners in our courts of justice to allow the jury to find any other verdict than that they have done. Your unhappy mother, like a drowning person catching at a straw, spoke of some former eccentricities of yours to prove that you were insane when you committed this dreadful act. The sentence of this court is that you should be hanged until you are dead and buried within the precincts of the jail. The prisoner was led from the dock, apparently slightly excited, but unmoved. In the weeks that followed his conviction, George Keble Edwards showed little sign of remorse. He was regularly visited in Maidstone jail by the Reverend Joseph Knott, minister of the Tabernacle Chapel near Romney Place, a man who, by all accounts, showed remarkable patience and tact in the thankless task of preparing an unrepentant young murderer for death. Edwards maintained his innocence to the very last days, even remarking more than once of his dead brother, it served him right. But on the eve of his execution, under the Reverend Knott's urging, he finally agreed to write out what he called the full truth of what had happened that night. The letter he handed to the governor of the gaol read in part: The night the affair happened, I had been drinking. When I came home, my brother said he'd lock me out next time I came in so late. We quarrelled. He struck at me with a stick, and I bobbed inside. I ran downstairs, fetched the axe, and went up again. He struck me once more, and I ran in at him with the axe. It was done in great excitement and irritation. I never meant to do what I did, but it's done now, and I'm sorry for it. I hope he is now in paradise. That is all the harm I wish him." The letter ends with the words, "After the duel was over, I went downstairs and out of the front door." But the Maidstone Journal, which had followed the case from the beginning, was quick to reject his account outright. "For ourselves," the paper wrote, "we do not believe one word of the duel he speaks of. Every fact of the case compels the conclusion that the fatal blows were given while his brother lay asleep. Investigators confirmed there were walking sticks in the room, but none had been moved. The father, a man of light sleep, would surely have heard any struggle. The newspaper's conclusion was as cold as it was certain. The brother never woke. The crime was silent, swift, and final. Further particulars. And finally, in this week's further particulars, if you've ever tried to get your money's worth from an insurance policy, spare a thought for the gentleman who took the idea of fire damage rather too literally. Armed with a shipment of cigars, a £200 policy, and a questionable understanding of the word fraud, one enterprising merchant thought he'd cracked the system. The result? A showdown with the insurance companies worthy of a Victorian courtroom farce, and a very smoky lesson in legal fine print. From the Dundee Advertiser, the 23rd of August, 1865, Cigar Insurance. As an instance of sharp practice, it is related that a merchant going to America and back went to an insurance office and wished to insure separately 1,000 cigars valued at £200 against loss by water or fire. The insurance was agreed to. After the lapse of 6 months, he made his appearance at the insurance office and demanded his money, as the cigars had all been burnt. "Yes, on board the vessel. I smoked them and therefore burnt them all myself, and the insurance says against fire." The secretary seemed taken aback and had nothing to say, so the merchant said he would call the next day for his money, and the next day he called, but was met by the solicitor of the company, who told him that he did not relinquish his claim. He would be prosecuted as one who had knowingly and wilfully set fire to goods assured by the company. The biter was bitten. And that concludes this evening's episode of axe-wielding mayhem in the still of the night. If you've survived intact, do consider subscribing, liking and sharing before the mighty YouTube algorithm awakens and begins rearranging thumbnails in a fit of pique, or hyping if you have been deigned that privilege. Each click keeps the dragon pacified and ensures the archives remain gloriously unsinged. And for those kindly supporting the archives on Patreon, thank you. Your help keeps the research going, the tea flowing, and the occasional ferret of history thoroughly over-caffeinated. Not a Patreon member? Check out our archive of over 750 episodes and daily drops, all for a measly £5 a month. Find us at News of the Times Historical Crime at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, licensed fog wrangler and assistant clerk to the Society for the Preservation of Alarmingly Large Bustles. Until next time, sleep well, preferably in separate rooms.